Everyone dreams to travel back in time, but it will be wise to avoid the 20th century, as it was an incubator of many wars. The severity and scale of these conflicts, particularly World War II, altered the world in ways that can still be felt today. The war not only caused important geopolitical developments, but it also revealed humanity's capacity for amazing bravery and appalling evil. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world began to rebuild, a critical question lingered. What happened to the German generals who had once commanded the formidable Wehrmacht? This question not only unravels the fates of those who wielded immense military power, but also explores the complex legacy of their actions. The Wehrmacht, Nazi Germany's unified armed forces from 1935 to 1945, was a force to be reckoned with, comprising the Heer, the German Army, the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy, and the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force. It replaced the earlier Reichswehr, symbolizing the Nazi regime's bold efforts to surpass the limits set by the Treaty of Versailles. Early in the war, the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, marked by rapid and overwhelming strikes, left a trail of awe and destruction. Its campaigns in France, the Soviet Union, and North Africa were initially seen as daring and successful. However, as the war progressed, these advances would strain the Wehrmacht's capabilities, revealing weaknesses in strategy and logistics. Despite its impressive early successes, the Wehrmacht's cooperation with the SS and Einsatzgruppen in committing war crimes during the conflict casts a long shadow over its legacy. The extent of these atrocities, particularly in the Soviet Union and occupied territories, challenges the myth of a clean Wehrmacht and complicates our understanding of its role in the war. By the end of the war, the Wehrmacht had seen the service of approximately 18 million men. Yet the cost was staggering, over 11 million lost lives, including those missing, killed, or dying in captivity. With only a few high-ranking officers facing trial for war crimes, many of the Wehrmacht's leaders escaped legal accountability. The post-war fate of German generals is critical to understanding not only the immediate aftermath of World War II, but also its long-term impact on world history. The treatment of these generals reflects a larger effort to construct a moral and legal framework for preventing future atrocities. The Nuremberg trials, for example, were about more than merely punishing the offenders. They also created precedents for international law and human rights. The way these generals were convicted, imprisoned, or rehabilitated demonstrates the Allies' dedication to tackling war crimes and holding people accountable for their acts. As the shadow of World War II faded from Europe on May 7, 1945, the sounds of surrender echoed throughout the continent. However, the history of the surrender of Germany and its generals is more complex than a single date or ceremony. For, as history has shown, the path to peace is rarely clear. The great act of surrender was initiated on that fateful day in the peaceful surroundings of Reims, France. The German High Command, under General Alfred Jodl, signed the Act of Military Surrender and the ceasefire agreement. This deed, carried out in front of Allied officials, officially ended the war in Europe. The ceasefire was scheduled to begin precisely at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time on May 8th, a date that would soon become the symbol of victory in Europe, or VE Day. But the surrender in Reims was not the end of the tragic story. The geopolitical difficulties that simmered under the surface of Allied unity were far from over. The Soviet Union, who had suffered the brunt of the war's ferocity, was gravely concerned that the surrender had been negotiated without their direct participation. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who had been increasingly frustrated as the Allies discussed terms, demanded a second surrender ceremony. He urged that Germany's surrender should be carried out in Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. and witnessed by Soviet military chiefs who had played such an important role in the final assault against Nazi forces. The Allied countries agreed to Stalin's demands, hoping to avoid undercutting Soviet contributions or inflaming already fragile post-war relations. On May 8, 1945, a second ceremony was held in Karlshorst, a neighborhood of Berlin. This time, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Germany's senior military commander, signed the surrender paperwork in front of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and a small group of Allied diplomats. This event, held just as the first ceasefire was set to go into force, formally ended Nazi Germany's reign of terror. This twofold surrender, covering two ceremonies at two different locations, reveals much about the tumultuous dynamics of post-war diplomacy. The Rheims surrender may have signaled the end of combat fighting, but the Berlin Agreement highlighted the Soviet Union's critical role and the intricacies of Allied politics. Now that the dust had cleared on these momentous surrenders, a new phase began: the capture and detention of Germany's military leaders. The fall of the Third Reich marked not just a military victory, but also the start of a painstaking process of responsibility. The Allied troops, determined to prevent the rebirth of fascist ideology and to redress the Nazi regime war crimes, started a massive effort to seize high-ranking German officials. The capture of these generals was quick and orderly. With surrender in effect, Allied troops spread across Europe, rounding up senior members of the German military leadership. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl were among those seized, and their imprisonment marked a significant departure from their previous positions of enormous influence. These generals, who had formerly commanded massive armies and devised war plans, were now imprisoned in secure prisons under Allied supervision. The procedure of capturing these high-ranking commanders was both logistical and symbolic. Detention centers were created in a variety of sites, ranging from internment camps to secure holding facilities, to ensure that these people could not flee or reunite. The Allied troops, particularly the Americans and British, worked tirelessly to isolate these generals from their prior networks and secure their full accountability. However, the detention of these generals was not without obstacles. The Allies faced a complicated environment of legal, political, and ethical issues. The treatment of these soldiers became a focal point for discussions about justice and the new international order that emerged in the aftermath of the war. The choice to prosecute or release these individuals was carefully considered, weighing the necessity for justice against the challenges of post-war reconstruction. The trials that followed the surrender were as much about establishing a precedent as they were about determining individual responsibility. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, were a watershed moment in international law, establishing concepts of accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The jailed generals confronted a new world order in which their previous activities were evaluated, as were their involvement in the fight. The entire world kept a watchful eye on these high-ranking officials while they waited for their trial. The destiny of these generals would not only determine their personal fates, but it would also send a clear warning about the dangers of aggressive militarism and authoritarian governments. The trials and their outcomes were viewed as significant steps towards addressing the war's legacies and laying the groundwork for a more just and stable international society. The dual surrender of Germany exemplified the complicated interaction of Allied diplomacy and the difficult process of concluding a worldwide struggle. The capture and detention of German generals demonstrated the Allies' commitment to accountability and the difficulties of navigating a post-war environment. These events, which occurred in the weeks following the surrender, paved the way for a new era of international relations and justice, influencing the course of history for years to come. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany waged a brutal campaign of conquest and devastation. They invaded various nations, and in the Soviet Union alone, their crimes claimed 27 million deaths. As the Allies began to organize for justice, views on how to deal with Nazi leaders differed greatly. The Soviet Union supported a show trial. The United Kingdom advocated quick executions, and France and the United States preferred a more balanced approach. By mid-1945, the Allied powers, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, had achieved an agreement. They resolved to establish a joint tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany, which was currently occupied. This tribunal would be governed by the Nuremberg Charter, a legal instrument that specified how the trials would be handled. From November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, tried 22 of the most senior surviving Nazi officials. These leaders came from a variety of backgrounds: political, military, and economic. 6 important Nazi groups were also prosecuted. The purpose was not just to punish these individuals, but also to document the full scope of Nazi crimes, teach the German people about history, and destroy the old German elite that had supported the government. One of the significant outcomes of the trials was the designation of the crime of preparing and waging aggressive war as the highest international crime. This word expressed the concept that such crimes were more than just isolated acts of aggression. They constituted an underlying evil. The majority of these defendants were also charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, with a particular emphasis on the Holocaust, the methodical slaughter of millions of Jews and others considered undesirable by the Nazi state. In addition to the main Nuremberg trials, the U.S. held 12 supplemental trials that probed more into the Holocaust and other war crimes. These trials concentrated on lower-level perpetrators who assisted in the implementation of Nazi policy. The trials were contentious at the time because they retroactively criminalized violent warfare, which had previously not been formally classified as a crime. However, their most significant innovation was holding individuals accountable for infractions of international law. This concept established the foundation for current international criminal law, ushering in a new era in which individuals may be held accountable for atrocities committed on a worldwide scale. The Nuremberg trials establish a precedent that would influence how the world dealt with war crimes and human rights breaches for decades to come. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany swept throughout Europe, invading Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union. Their hostility was more than just a military threat. It was carried out with unparalleled violence. In the Soviet Union alone, the conflict killed 27 million people, the majority of whom were civilians, a staggering 1/7 of the pre-war population. The world was aware that the Nazis' acts were particularly horrific. The methodical massacre of millions of Jews created new chapters of war crimes. In early 1942, delegates from 9 governments in exile from German-occupied nations banded together to propose the establishment of an international court to bring the offenders to justice. However, this suggestion drew opposition. The United States and the United Kingdom were cautious, partially due to previous failures to prosecute war crimes following World War I. Instead, in October 1943, the United Nations War Crimes Commission was formed in London. However, without Soviet involvement, this commission struggled to define its mandate. There was discussion about what constitutes a war crime. Belgian jurist Marcel de Beer and Czech law scholar Bohuslav Acer advocated for a larger definition that encompassed offenses beyond military acts. On November 1, 1943, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States released the Moscow Declaration. This was a severe warning to the Nazi leadership. It indicated their aim to track them down wherever they may try to hide and bring them to justice. The declaration stated that high-ranking Nazis who committed atrocities in many nations would face a joint prosecution, while others would be tried where their crimes occurred. Aaron Trainin, a Soviet jurist, was key in developing the legal underpinning for these trials. He created the concept of crimes against peace, which would be essential to the Nuremberg trials. Trainin's views caught on in the West and were universally embraced. Among the Allies, the Soviet Union was the most vocal in holding Nazi officials accountable for not only war crimes, but also for aggression itself. The Soviets desired a trial that would not only establish the guilt of Nazi officials, but also back their claim for war reparations to help rebuild their destroyed economy. They imagined a trial comparable to the Moscow trials of the 1930s, with a predetermined result. On the other hand, the United States desired a trial that would be perceived as fair and legitimate. They intended to restructure Germany while demonstrating the superiority of the Western system. By late 1944 and early 1945, the U.S. Department of War was working on proposals for an international tribunal. However, the British government was inclined towards executing Nazi leaders. They were concerned about the failures of post-World War I tribunals and were skeptical of imposing retroactive criminality. The precise form of justice was still unclear at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. However, on May 2, 1945, at the San Francisco Conference, U.S. President Harry S. Truman announced the formation of an international military tribunal. Just 6 days later, on May 8th, Germany unconditionally surrendered, bringing the European War to an end. In the summer of 1945, an important meeting was held in London. From June 26 to August 2nd, representatives from France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States came together to shape one of history's most momentous legal processes. This discussion was critical in determining how to hold those responsible for the war accountable. At the London conference, it was unclear whether any trial would take place. There was a dispute about which crimes would be prosecuted: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. The idea of waging aggressive battles was particularly divisive. The law at the time did not clearly define criminal responsibility for aggression. Despite opposition from other Allied nations, American negotiator Robert H. Jackson, who would eventually become a Supreme Court justice, remained firm. He vowed to withdraw if aggressiveness was not included, seeing it as a significant justification for the U.S. engagement in the war. Jackson's stance was firm, yet he needed to make sacrifices. The other allies were concerned that defining crimes against peace would interfere with the UN Security Council's actions. The legal landscape was altering, and the allies were attempting to establish new norms of accountability. The idea of war crimes was previously established, and it dealt with infractions of wartime conduct. However, these regulations did not address how governments handled their own citizens. Legal professionals were faced with the issue of prosecuting crimes against individuals, such as German Jews. Jackson's proposition renamed a Soviet concept for a charge of crimes against people as crimes against humanity. This phrase had previously been employed in a variety of circumstances, but it now has a new, powerful meaning. The final wording included murder, extermination, enslavement, and other heinous acts against civilians. To prevent having an international court oversee a government's treatment of its own people, the charter limited these charges to crimes committed in the context of an aggressive conflict. The Nuremberg Charter altered the way international law works by holding individuals, rather than states, accountable. The charter concentrated on Germany's conduct rather than those of the annihilated Axis states. Article 7 of the Charter eliminated the possibility of defendants claiming sovereign immunity, leaving the decision on the superior order's defense to the judges. The Nuremberg trials would be held at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, a city with symbolic value due to its affiliation with Nazi rallies. Despite being destroyed by explosions, the facility was chosen for its prison amenities. The proceedings were scheduled to start on August 8, 1945, when the Nuremberg Charter was signed in London. By early 1946, Nuremberg had become a thriving hive of activity. There were approximately 1,000 staff people from the 4 Allied nations, including lawyers, researchers, interpreters, and graphic designers. Each country has its own prosecutors and 2 judges. Robert H. Jackson led the United States team. Jackson, a brilliant orator, and his team believed that Nazism was a divergence from Western principles, and they hoped that the trial would address and fix that. The British team was led by Hartley Shawcross, the Attorney General for England and Wales, with assistance from David Maxwell Fyfe. François de Menthon, the French prosecutor who had been involved in the trials of Vichy France leaders, was replaced by Auguste Charpentier de Ribes. Iona Nikitchenko, the Soviet Union's head prosecutor, was replaced by Roman Rudenko, a well-known orator. The procedure of writing the indictment was complicated. The British focused on aggressive warfare, whilst Americans and others addressed war crimes and crimes against humanity. The accusation of conspiracy, which was not originally included in the Charter, became fundamental to the trial. It enabled the trial to address a wide range of crimes and make many Nazi leaders accountable, including those who did not directly order the killings, but were part of the Nazi infrastructure. The work of translating and organizing evidence was huge. The tribunal accepted a variety of evidence, including documents, photographs, and films. Despite the difficulties, the evidence intended to make the magnitude of the crimes obvious. The trial proceedings were frequently slow, in part because evidence had to be examined many times and translated into the tribunal's official languages of English, French, and Russian. As the trial progressed, the Nuremberg Charter established the framework for international justice, holding individuals accountable and changing the legal environment for subsequent generations. The International Military Tribunal for the Nuremberg trials began on November 20, 1945. Despite a plea by Soviet prosecutors for extra time, the trial continued. All of the accused pled not guilty. Prosecutors had defined purpose in mind, and it was not only to obtain convictions. They aimed to compile indisputable proof of Nazi crimes, emphasize individual responsibility, and establish the crime of aggression under international law. The trial also functioned as a lesson for the German people and a means for the Allies to separate themselves from previous measures that may have appeared conciliatory. Robert Jackson, the lead American prosecutor, delivered an opening remark that established the tone. He explained that all of the Nazis' other misdeeds stemmed from aggressive warfare. Even the defendants gave positive feedback on the speech. However, the American case suffered, particularly when attempting to offer proof of early Nazi aggression, such as the invasion of Austria. In one dramatic moment, a film with footage from Nazi concentration camps was screened. This stunned both the defendants and the judges, prompting an adjournment. The British took over the case, focusing on crimes against peace. Shawcross, their prosecutor, delivered a speech linking Nazi acts to previous international accords and conventions. The British case lasted 4 days, addressing treaties breached by Germany and laying the groundwork for specific individuals to face charges. The French had a different approach. They investigated how Nazi ideology was embedded in Germany's history, tying crimes to the emergence of pan-Germanism and imperialism. French prosecutors emphasized forced labor, economic exploitation, and the cruel annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. Their technique underlined the German people's broader complicity, drawing on post-war police reports and victim testimony. Resistance fighter Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, an Auschwitz survivor, presented moving evidence about the crimes she had experienced. Next, the Soviets presented their case. The Soviet prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, gave a picture of the misery caused by Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. He contacted Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, a former high-ranking Nazi officer who implicated many of the accused, including Göring and Keitel, in Nazi crimes. The Soviets also provided horrible proof, such as the starving of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. They emphasized the systematic murder of Jews and the deportation of civilians to Germany for forced labor. Soviet prosecutors even exhibited terrible images, such as footage from the liberation of Majdanek and Auschwitz. Survivors of the Holocaust and other heinous Nazi crimes also revealed their experiences. When it was the defense's turn, they spent months attempting to transfer blame. While none of the defendants denied the acts were committed, many claimed they were oblivious or had no control. They frequently blamed Hitler, Himmler, and other high-ranking Nazis, who were long deceased. Defense counsel even sought to argue that authoritarian German society excused their clients' acts, but the court did not accept it. Some arguments focused on moral equivalence, claiming that the Allies committed identical crimes. However, this defense was rejected. Nonetheless, the defendants had some leeway to present their case, summoning witnesses and even discrediting some claims. As the trial came to a close, attention switched to crimes against humanity, including the Holocaust. The prosecution's closing arguments, which included references to genocide, made it evident that the slaughter of millions of Jews would be fundamental to the trial's history. On August 31st, the closing arguments were delivered. The judges then proceeded to deliberate. Their task was huge. They ruled that aggressive war was the most serious crime, dubbed the supreme international crime. The panel agreed with the prosecution that the Nazis intended to disturb Europe and establish a greater Germany. The verdicts were finally given. The trial had accomplished its objectives. It exposed the horrors of the Nazi dictatorship, established legal precedents for future war crimes trials, and held individuals accountable for the unspeakable atrocities committed during World War II. As the final gunshots of World War II fell silent in 1945, a new war began in courtrooms across Europe, holding those responsible for the Nazi regime's atrocities accountable. These trials would mark the end of the German military's top command generals, who had previously led violent wars throughout Europe and the Atlantic, now faced significant prison sentences. But were these men war criminals or just soldiers following orders? Many of Germany's top military officers were tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. These generals, who formerly wielded great power, were suddenly subjected to humiliating public trials, made to account for their involvement in a system that devastated Europe. The punishments for these high-ranking officials varied according to the nature of their offenses and the evidence produced at trial. Some were sentenced to life in jail, while others received fixed-term or even death sentences. Their rank, health, and perceptions of their responsibility for Nazi Germany's atrocities all had an impact on the conditions of their imprisonment. While many of the generals were imprisoned in extremely severe conditions, particularly in the early post-war years, their circumstances improved slightly with time, particularly for those imprisoned in Spandau Prison, the infamous facility that housed many of the war's most notorious characters. Spandau, built in the early 1870s and located in Berlin's British district, served as the long-term home of famous Nazis such as Albert Speer and Rudolf Hess. The prison was secluded, guarded by alternating Allied forces, and there was minimal interaction among the detainees. For these generals, jail meant both solitude and the gradual disintegration of their military identities. Erich Raeder, the Grand Admiral of Germany's Navy, was among the most important persons imprisoned. Erich Raeder was the architect of Germany's resurrected navy, the Kriegsmarine, and his life was defined by the sea. After World War I, when Germany's navy was in disarray, Raeder played a critical part in rebuilding its previous power. As Hitler's dedicated servant, he led daring, aggressive efforts to dominate the North Atlantic. However, power is not without its risks. Raeder's downfall began when he clashed with Hitler, objecting to some of the dictator's increasingly dangerous war preparations. After resigning in 1943, he believed he had avoided the worst of what was to come. But the conclusion of the war brought the Nuremberg trials, and Raeder was not immune from prosecution. He was charged with crimes against peace and war crimes for orchestrating Germany's strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which was a harsh technique that attacked both enemy and neutral ships. This was a clear violation of international law. Raeder was sentenced to life imprisonment. His already poor health deteriorated while he was in prison. Spandau Prison, a cold and isolated fortress in Berlin, became his residence. His existence as a naval commander, once filled with the tumult and fury of war, had been replaced by years of monotony, solitude, and gradual physical decline. However, Raeder never truly embraced his culpability. In his memoirs, written while in prison, he portrayed himself as a faithful officer, simply carrying out orders, a patriot, dedicated to Germany's preservation. He served nearly a decade in prison before being released in 1955 for health reasons. It was a peaceful, unassuming conclusion for a man whose actions had sunk ships to the bottom of the ocean. If Raeder was a naval visionary, Karl Dönitz was a brilliant tactician. Dönitz's U-boat campaign terrorized the Atlantic as wolf packs of submarines targeted Allied ships with deadly accuracy. His genius as a tactician prolonged the war and compelled the Allies to devote enormous resources to defending their supply lines. However, Dönitz's involvement in the war became even more convoluted in the final days of the Third Reich. As Hitler's grip on power weakened, he made an unexpected decision. Karl Dönitz would be his successor. Dönitz governed what remained of Germany for a few weeks after the Nazi dictatorship crumbled, eventually overseeing the country's surrender. Dönitz's leadership in the war's last days was pragmatic. He realized the end was near and sought to negotiate terms that would preserve German lives. However, at the Nuremberg trials, pragmatism was insufficient to protect him from conviction. Dönitz was accused of war crimes, primarily for his role in the U-boat campaign. His response was straightforward. The Allies, particularly the British, had employed identical techniques during the war. He saw himself as fighting an equal war. Despite this, the court found him guilty, although the complexities of his activities resulted in a more compassionate penalty. Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is significantly less than Raeder's life term. His time at Spandau was strict, but not as brutal as the others. He spent his time in Spandau with other prominent convicts, including Albert Speer and Rudolf Hess. Spandau's seclusion, the never-ending cycle of days and nights in prison, forced him to consider his legacy. Did he consider himself a war criminal? Maybe not. Dönitz, like Raeder, claimed to be a military man, dedicated to his nation and willing to do whatever it took to prevail. When Dönitz was released in 1956, he settled into a tranquil retirement. He rarely spoke in public, with the exception of publishing his memoirs, in which he defended his wartime judgments while portraying himself as a soldier rather than a Nazi. Dönitz died in 1980, leaving a mixed legacy of military brilliance, tainted by his involvement with the Third Reich. In the early days after Germany's collapse, the Allies had a monumental task: rid the country of Nazi ideology. The denazification effort sought to remove former Nazi leaders from positions of power and dismantle the traces of dictatorship that had thrown the entire world into conflict. But how can you purify an entire culture when so many people have been involved, directly or indirectly? The military found the process very complex. German generals had engineered some of the most strategic military battles of the 20th century, and several had occupied high-ranking posts within the Nazi regime. They swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler himself. However, not all of them were ideological Nazis. Some were professional officers focused on military tactics rather than political theory. The denazification process was not uniform. Methods and goals differed between the occupation zones of the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Some generals faced tribunals, while others just filled out questionnaires outlining their activities throughout the war. But the purpose was clear: to ensure that the military commanders who had served under Hitler no longer had influence in the new Germany. However, as time passed, the political winds began to change. The Cold War was beginning, and the West's erstwhile adversaries, the Soviet Union, presented a new menace. Former Nazi generals, with their military expertise and strategic insight, were now regarded not only as war criminals, but also as potential assets in the fight against communism. For certain generals, the changing geopolitical realities meant early release and, in some cases, complete pardons. The world appeared inclined to forgive, as long as these men could be useful in the upcoming ideological fight. This sparked debate, as survivors of Nazi tyranny and families of those killed in the war questioned whether justice had truly been delivered. One of the most noteworthy cases is that of Heinz Guderian, who is widely regarded as the father of the Blitzkrieg, Germany's lightning-fast military tactic that transformed modern warfare. Guderian's brilliance on the battlefield was evident. His armored division sliced through Poland and France with merciless efficiency, cementing his reputation as one of the war's most formidable tacticians. Despite his military brilliance, Guderian's relationship with the Nazi dictatorship was more pragmatic than ideological. He never joined the Nazi Party and was known to have disagreed with Hitler on numerous occasions over strategic issues. Guderian's post-war destiny reflected this complexity. Initially held and questioned during the denazification process, he was eventually released without trial in 1948. His early release sparked debate. Was Guderian praised for his military prowess, or was his comparatively non-ideological position the saving grace? Many believe that his quick release reflected the Allies' changed priorities, a determination to stabilize Germany and prepare for a potential new war, this time against the Soviets. Kesselring was sentenced to death by a British military tribunal in 1947. With his offenses deemed serious enough to merit the ultimate punishment. But his story did not stop there. As the Cold War progressed, political and public opinion began to change. Many Germans considered Kesselring as a patriot, a guy who fought heroically for his country, despite his ruthless ways. As pressure built, Kesselring's death sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he was completely pardoned in 1952. Some cheered Kesselring's release, while others saw it as a profound violation of justice. The families of those slaughtered in Italy, as well as survivors of Nazi atrocities, were shocked. How would a guy guilty for such crimes be permitted to go free? For Kesselring, this was more than just freedom. It was vindication. He maintained his innocence throughout his life, claiming that he had simply obeyed orders amid the confusion of war. He lived until 1960 when he died, leaving a complicated legacy. Some saw him as a hero, others as a war criminal. The denazification process, which aimed to rid Germany of its Nazi legacy, was never easy. For other generals such as Heinz Guderian, it meant a quick return to civilian life. Others, like Albert Kesselring, experienced a roller coaster of convictions, pardons, and public opinion. In the years following World War II, the distinction between guilt and duty, soldier and war criminal, became increasingly blurred. As the Nuremberg trials resonated around the world, bringing to justice many of the architects of Nazi Germany's war machine, not all individuals guilty faced the consequences they deserved. Some high-ranking military generals, intelligence officers, and war criminals were able to evade justice, avoiding the tribunals that were intended to bring them accountable. Their fates were as diverse as their crimes. Some fled to faraway places, some went into hiding for decades, and a few even managed to carve out new lives and occupations free of history's judgment. But what happened to the men? How did they escape the clutches of post-war justice? And how did they live with the weight of their deeds during the war towering over them like a shadow? In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe was in anarchy. Borders were redrawn, governments were dismissed, and millions of people were uprooted, creating the ideal conditions for former Nazi officers to vanish. For some, the key to survival lay in well-planned escape routes, frequently with the covert support of friendly associates. The rat lines were a network of escape routes used by Nazi war criminals to evacuate Europe, often to South America. Former SS officers, Catholic clergy, and friendly locals helped individuals who had once led armies or committed heinous crimes slip into the anonymity of new lives in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Few escaping generals and men would become as notorious as Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. During the war, Barbie was the leader of the Gestapo in Lyon, France, where he was in charge of the savage torture and death of French resistance members, as well as the deportation of thousands of Jews to concentration camps. Barbie, unlike many of his peers, did not face a Nuremberg trial following the war. Instead, he slipped through the seams of post-war Europe's fragmented intelligence services. Surprisingly, he was shielded by members of the United States military, who considered him as a useful asset in the looming Cold War. Barbie was recruited by U.S. intelligence, and his wartime atrocities were disregarded in exchange for information about communist activity in Europe. Barbie lived under an assumed identity for many years before moving to Bolivia, where he lived freely for decades. He rose to prominence in Bolivian political and military circles, eventually serving as the government's advisor. Barbie's ability to not only dodge justice but prosper in a foreign country is one of the most obvious failures of post-war justice. Klaus Barbie was finally extradited to France in 1983, some 40 years after the war, to face charges of crimes against humanity. His trial was one of the most momentous in post-war France, shedding light not only on his own crimes but also on the larger problem of how many war criminals evaded prosecution. He was caught and sentenced to life in jail in 1987, but justice had long been served for the thousands of people he had tortured. Not all Nazi generals who evaded indictment went into hiding or assumed new identities. Some, such as Wilhelm List, were able to shun the spotlight while leading very comfortable lives during the war. List was one of Hitler's most trusted generals, commanding ruthless assaults in the Balkans that resulted in mass civilian murders and the destruction of entire communities. Despite his part in managing some of the war's most deadly operations, List's post-war destiny was comparatively benign in comparison to others. In 1947, he was tried in the hostages trial, which was one of the secondary Nuremberg proceedings focusing on crimes committed during Germany's Balkan campaign. List was found guilty of war crimes and condemned to life in jail, but he was freed in 1952 after only a few years due to health concerns. List spent the rest of his life in quiet retirement, living quietly in West Germany until his death in 1971. Critics of post-war justice frequently cite List as an example of how senior military personnel were able to evade the full consequences of their acts, with their crimes eclipsed by the wider focus on political and SS leaders. Edward Roschmann, the commandant of the Riga ghetto, is one of the most horrifying examples of a war criminal who escaped justice. He was responsible for the slaughter of tens of thousands of Jews. Roschmann, known as the Butcher of Riga, was a sadist who thrived on the agony of others. But when the war ended, Roschmann vanished. Roschmann, like Barbie, used fraudulent passports and aliases to flee Europe, eventually arriving in Argentina. There, under the alias Federico Wegener, he lived in relative peace, taking advantage of Juan Perón's government's protective policies, which provided a safe harbor for many former Nazis. Despite efforts by Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal to locate him, Roschmann evaded capture for years. He was even thought to have been involved in arms smuggling in the 1950s. Roschmann's name rose to prominence following the publication of Frederick Forsyth's 1972 novel, The Odessa File, which featured his experience as a central plot point. Despite his reputation, Roschmann would never be tried for his crimes. He died in 1977 in Paraguay, a free man, having avoided the punishment that so many of his victims never saw. The experiences of Barbie, List, and Roschmann reflect a greater systemic failure that lingered in the aftermath of World War II. While many of the Nazis' regime's most recognizable figures, Göring, Hess, and Ribbentrop, were prosecuted, a large number of generals, SS officers, and intelligence officials slipped through the gaps. Historians and critics of the post-war justice system have identified a number of reasons for its failure. The Cold War caused the most significant geopolitical chaos. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rose, former Nazis with specialized knowledge, particularly in military or espionage matters, became attractive assets. Men like Barbie were protected from prosecution, and their misdeeds were overlooked in the name of resisting the burgeoning communist danger. Furthermore, the scale of the Nazi regime's crimes overwhelmed the Allied legal system. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, it was impossible to locate every war criminal. Many just vanished into the populace, adopting new identities or fleeing to remote places where they were never discovered. In the years following the World War II, humanity was on the verge of a new conflict, the Cold War. Ideological lines were set, with the United States and the Soviet Union competing for control. The Second World War winners, now unified against a common enemy, turned to their old enemies for partnerships to combat the emerging communist threat. In this combustible environment, several of Nazi Germany's most notorious military figures were not only spared complete censure, but even hired by the very countries that they had previously fought against. As Europe rebuilt from the ashes of war, new challenges arose. The Soviet Union's fast advance into Eastern Europe caused shockwaves throughout the West. Desperate to oppose Soviet influence and safeguard their interests, the United States and its allies confronted a harsh reality. They required experienced military leaders to guide them through this new global order. Surprisingly, some of the greatest candidates for the position had donned the uniform of their former enemy, the German Wehrmacht. For many high-level Nazi leaders, the Cold War provided an unexpected lifeline. Instead of risking life in prison, they were recruited by the West to impart their military and intelligence capabilities. It was a realistic, if morally complicated decision. Some considered these alliances as a necessary evil in the struggle against communism, while others saw them as a risky surrender of beliefs. Few names better represent this peculiar period of post-war collaboration than Reinhard Gehlen, a former Nazi intelligence officer whose knowledge of Soviet politics propelled him to become one of West Germany's most powerful men during the Cold War. During the war, Galen focused on intelligence operations on the Eastern Front, gathering critical information on Soviet army movements. His extensive knowledge of the Soviet military and political scene rendered him vital to Nazi leadership. But as the war ended and the Nazi power disintegrated, Galen saw the writing on the wall. In 1945, Galen made a risky step. Instead of retiring into hiding, as many Nazi leaders did, he actively sought out American forces, providing them with his massive intelligence files on the Soviet Union in exchange for security. Recognizing the worth of his knowledge, the Americans reached an agreement with him. Galen was transported to the United States and debriefed by American intelligence officials. His extensive network of spies and informants, along with his expertise in Soviet military strategy, made him a valuable asset. In 1946, he was brought back to Germany to oversee a new intelligence agency that would become known as the Galen Agency. With American support, the Galen Organization was founded as West Germany's premier intelligence service, tasked with gathering information on the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies. For more than a decade, Galen and his team, many of whom were former Wehrmacht and SS officers, were the West's primary source of information on Soviet activity in Eastern Europe. Critics claim that the Americans' cooperation with Galen was one of their most morally problematic moves throughout the Cold War. Galen's network was not limited to military personnel. Many of his operatives had been deeply involved in Nazi war crimes, and their roles in the intelligence agency provided them with a means of avoiding prosecution. Some historians are questioning the exact cost of America's reliance on Galen and his organization. However, from a strategic aspect, the Galen Organization was effective. It gave critical intelligence to the West during the early phases of the Cold War, assisting in the monitoring of Soviet army movements, the detection of espionage activities, and the impact of political results in Eastern Europe. Galen's prominence peaked in 1956, when his agency was legally merged into the newly formed Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, with Galen serving as its first president. For nearly 2 decades, Galen led West Germany's intelligence activities, directing the BND through some of the Cold War's most challenging years. However, his past would always haunt him. And as the 1960s continued, public scrutiny of former Nazi leaders in government positions grew. Galen's leadership was criticized for both his organization's poor moral foundation and many intelligence blunders that harmed West Germany's relationship with its allies. Reinhard Galen's biography represents a broader pattern of Cold War pragmatism. Former Nazi military leaders were regarded as important assets, both for their technical skill and their capacity to oppose Soviet influence. Galen was not the only one. Many former Wehrmacht officers were recruited into NATO and West German military formations in the 1950s and 1960s, with the goal of creating a new German army capable of opposing Soviet assault. These alliances were not without controversy. Critics argue that by hiring former Nazis, the West conveyed a message that ideological purity was less important than strategic gain. While the Nuremberg trials sought to prosecute Nazi war criminals, some of these same individuals were secretly reinstated in positions of authority, allowing them to once again decide Europe's future. Historians remain divided on this issue. Some say that the West had no choice but to rely on men like Galen. The Soviet Union posed an existential threat, and the knowledge of former Nazi officers was critical during the early phases of the Cold War. Others, however, see it as a moral failure, a betrayal of the fundamental ideas for which the Allies fought during World War II. Reinhard Galen retired from the BND in 1968, and his contribution in developing West Germany's intelligence activities was overshadowed by his background. He spent his final years in relative anonymity, never quite escaping the shadow of his previous life as a Nazi official. Today, his legacy is fraught with debate. On the one hand, he guided the West through the treacherous early years of the Cold War, giving important intelligence. On the other hand, his employment of former Nazi collaborators and readiness to make deals with war criminals continue to tarnish his reputation. In the end, as we look at the Cold War and the alliances forged in its name, we are left with a lingering question. How far should a country go to ensure its security? And at what moral cost? The story of the generals and war criminals who escaped justice serves as a reminder that while history might provide moments of reckoning, it is not always complete. The Nuremberg trials may have brought many people accountable, but for every war criminal who faced a judge, there were others who retreated into the shadows, living their lives away from the cries of those they killed. As time passes, these guys remind us that justice, no matter how powerful, is not always guaranteed.